The future of controllers.
The future of controllers and the past.
And the past.
Yeah.
We're just looking at, like, controllers that aren't just what you typically think of when you think of controllers.
Right. We're trying to look at things that are not your classic 4-button D-pad joystick combo where, I mean, obviously, historically, it was just D-pad and buttons.
Yeah.
And then it became D-pad, buttons, and joystick. And now we're on to bigger, better, crazier things.
Stuff.
And I mean, like we said, we'll talk a little bit about some of the historical examples that kind of maybe, to a certain extent, paved the way to these more modern iterations.
I think we need to start with, like, yes, the NES, Sega, typical D-pad 4 or 6 button controllers, right?
Yep.
Which back then it was like all you had to do. Maybe you had some little shoulder buttons,
Mm-hmm.
but it was your
the
fingers
SNES.
and your thumbs doing most of the work, right?
The old SNES with the 4 buttons, the 2 shoulders.
But the NES only had 2 buttons.
The NES was
D-pad.
just the D-pad and two buttons. The SNES is when you really stepped it up. You had 4 buttons
and some shoulder
and
buttons.
some shoulder buttons. And of course, Sega Genesis had 6 buttons.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, but even going back then, even then there was innovation in the controller sphere when you had things like, of course, the Power Glove.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Way too ahead of its time.
Way too ahead of its time. I mean, the Power Glove, just looking at it, it's like...
It's what you would think of it's like a VR.
Yeah, kind of. The movement of your hand controlled things.
Right.
And that was just really, like I said, it was way too ahead of its time.
Too ahead of its time. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know.
There wasn't a whole lot of implementation for it back then. Because it's literally like, okay, it maybe had like a little gyro sensor in it. Because so like,
you're driving a car.
This screenshot here is him driving it's a racing game. It's one of those like railroad racing games where you just kind of like switch lanes.
Yeah.
And like, but what else are you going to really do with that? There's not a whole lot.
Well, like we said, for the time that it was created, it was way too ahead of its time.
Yeah.
It was something that really didn't have a whole lot of implementation. Kind of the concept was way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
So I'll move back even. I think that
the Duck Hunt controller.
The Duck Hunt controller was another one I was going to say.
Controller.
Which was a classic NES.
Yeah, it was like it was a great addition to what was already established with Nintendo.
Yes.
I feel like the Duck Hunt controller was just... I can't remember how accurate it actually was. Right?
It was okay. Because I honestly...
The Zapper. It was
the Zapper.
the Zapper.
That's right. That's what it was called. I can say that I had used a Zapper in... I think the last time I laid hands on one was middle school, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I remember being okay.
Okay.
It was okay. It wasn't, it wasn't great. It wasn't as good as what we're getting today in a lot of current technologies.
Right.
But it worked, and it was fun. Like, it was really fun. It made Duck Hunt into a more fun game. It added you're a little kid, you get to shoot your cool little gun. I mean, that's a fun little addition for...
yeah, for sure. I mean, they did do that, like, the Nintendo Scope, like, attachment for it, which basically made it look like a rifle.
Right.
And that became permanent as, like, a staple item in Smash Bros. Because of it.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's one of those, like, where you could charge it up, right?
Yeah.
So that was, like, cool innovations back then. But then there was, like, a long gap of just, like...
I would say most of the 90s,
there wasn't really...
late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't much.
You had the Dreamcast controller, which was huge and weird and awkward.
Right.
And it had that little slot for you to put something in it.
A memory card, I think?
Yeah, like...
I think it was memory cards. But the Dreamcast controller was also, I think, to a certain extent, ahead of its time, especially when you look at the original Xbox controller.
Right. Oh, it had a little screen.
Yeah, it did have a little screen in it.
Or it could. Right. Yeah,
exactly.
The memory card.
The memory card /screen thing you can put into it. So it was ahead of its time. I mean, we're just now getting a screen on our.
Right,
nothing. Nobody has screens. I mean,
let's not oversell the screen here.
Let me tell you, the Dreamcast was the greatest video game invention of all time. It had a 6-screen in the controller. Whatever, it was early 2000s.
3D technology.
That was like what the screen you had in your cell phone. I mean,
that's true.
So
that's true.
Dreamcast was way ahead of its time. Way ahead of its time.
But let's not skip the DualShock 1, right? Because I think a lot of people forget about the DualShock 1 not having analog thumbsticks.
It did not. It was a D-pad and four buttons,
two
shoulder pads. Exactly.
And it worked for most things. And still, like, to this day, you can still do a lot of, like, Final Fantasies and stuff with the D-pad because that's just traditionally how it was always handled. I remember you couldn't use your analog thumbstick on, like, Final Fantasy VII back in the day. Like, even if you bought... Because they did later come out with the PlayStation 1 analog controller.
They did later, but you're right. When it initially came out, it was a simple D-pad and 4-button, 2-shoulder pad setup, or 4 shoulders. So, yeah, they had to innovate pretty quick. I mean, because as soon as you see the N64 controller, which has a joystick, and probably one of the dumbest controller layouts ever in the history of controllers.
It's a Trident.
If you don't think the N64 controller is the greatest controller of all time, you can eat my ass, buddy. Cause
yeah, it is a Trident. I mean, it looks cool,
and it also had an attachment slot.
That's true. Yeah, that's right. It did.
I mean, look at this. You can put like a rumble pack in the back. Beautiful.
You could
That's right, Rumble. I remember that.
Memory
you could
cards.
put Rumble packs in it. Oh my god!
Like back when controllers didn't have
come standard with a Rumble pack, you could slip one into your N64 controller. I remember that.
Which I mean, the PlayStation had memory cards on the machine, which made way more sense than putting it on the controller because then it's like, okay, there's data, save data on the machine. With Nintendo, like I remember playing Tony Hawk Pro Skater. And that first level over and over and over again. Because you basically have to play it arcade style in one sitting if you didn't have a memory card.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So you couldn't unlock stuff.
Yeah.
Because there was nowhere to save it.
Memory cards were very important.
Man.
But the N64 controller was, I do think, innovative in the sense it did have a joystick on it. That's about it. Nintendo,
they've always had some weird
controllers. But I think that actually segues us perfectly into the next really big leap in my mind for controllers, which ultimately ends up being the Wiimote. I think that the Xbox controller, the PlayStation 2 controller, and the GameCube controller all were quite similar.
Well, the GameCube controller was very different.
It was very different. I think the original Xbox controller was the first to have the offset joysticks, dual joystick setting.
What, the Duke?
Yeah.
The Xbox controller?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they've always stuck to that.
Right. They've had basically the exact same design all the way till now.
They stuck with it.
Right.
Well, they had they had 6 buttons back when they first came out. Because they had the white and the black buttons.
That's right. Well, that was...
They didn't have, like, the shoulder buttons.
That's
they had
right.
triggers, and then they had the white and the black.
Right. Yes.
But, so, yeah, it was offset.
It was offset. So you had your...
Movement, hand...
Your movement hand up, and your look right. And then you had your D-pad under it, whereas the PlayStation had them, obviously, parallel to one another.
Right.
Or, well, they're...
both low.
Right next to each other, yeah.
Yeah. In the center of the controller.
So I would argue that the next big leap in controller technology comes from your Wiimote.
Yeah.
When you add motion sensor, I mean, everyone's familiar with Wii. You can do cool stuff with it. So that brings us to today, I would say. We've got the standard controller.
Well, I mean, yeah, there hasn't been much innovation since the Wiimote.
Right.
Because even then, they took a step back. They did, like, the gamepad on the Wii U,
right.
And then now you got the Joy-Cons,
Joy-Cons,
which are basically the same thing.
Joy-Cons are even... less than what your Wiimotes can do. I mean, yes, you have a certain level of like axle control and everything, but it doesn't
Well, they do have IR.
It does.
At least one does.
Again, it's basically Wiimotes. They're more portable. They're easier to use. But that brings us into Nintendo once again, I would say, being pretty on the forefront of controller technology with Nintendo Labo.
Right. Which is basically attachments to your Joy-Con, but they're non-standard, build-it-yourself, DIY.
Cardboard.
Yeah.
Cutout attachments. And a lot of people were extremely excited about the Labos.
Kids were.
I think it's cool. I think it's a cool idea. It's a really interesting concept.
Yeah.
But it would have been nice. No, it's a cool concept. I don't know. It's a little bit of it's frivolous to a certain extent, I would say. I don't think it has like a ton of
Well, I mean, to me, I think it helps like with the young like push for STEM, right?
You're right. I think it is definitely geared more towards kids, but Nintendo in general has always been geared more towards kids. What it ends up being that a lot of adults just love Nintendo so much that it does well with adults. But
right.
I do agree with you. I think this is kind of the main appeal is to more towards kids. It's like having a Lego that's also you can eventually use it in a video game, which is cool.
Which is totally cool.
Yeah. So Nintendo Labo, that's one new innovation. That's something that really hasn't been done before, and the Joy-Cons give you the ability to do some really cool stuff with that. Yeah. So I think Labo I like where they're going with it. I like the idea behind it. Whether it's something I will use, I don't know. But
what it's pushing is innovation. It's pushing that idea of like, hey, try something new, try something different. Exactly. And GDC really took a step this year to push people to try and innovate and come up with those ideas. And they had what they called the Alt Control GDC showcase.
Right.
And they basically told people, hey, give us ideas for like different ways you can make a controller. And there's all kinds of stuff.
A ton of stuff
came out. Yeah.
So there were some really cool concepts at GDC that some people had come up with.
Because they all had games kind of paired with them. And so to me, the whole time I was like watching over this video and taking a look at it, it seemed to me like these are all like kind of arcade style concepts.
So yeah, the GDC had some really cool concepts. If you get a chance to check them out, Control GDC. Go check it out on your own time. I mean,
there's a lot of stuff on there.
Right. It's very video heavy, so there's a lot of cool, unique concepts up there. Right. Things that no one else has really done. But to continue on with that kind of vein of innovation.
Yeah, the Labo. I mean, PlayStation has done some things, and so
there's PlayStation Move, and there was
the Kinect.
And I think that both of those have been fairly unsuccessful. Kinect, very much so. They kind of really pushed the Kinect hard with the Xbox One.
Yeah.
And that did not work out at all.
Because it didn't work well.
I think it didn't work particularly well. You needed a lot of space to use it. It cost an extra $100. It was spying on you for one thing.
Right.
And
I don't know, the Xbox
One,
right,
like you said, that's
the launch bundle of the Xbox One came with Kinect.
Right.
Then they came out with the cheaper basic version that didn't, but the initial release of the Xbox One had the Kinect, and it had a new camera and a new microphone system that also was supposed to work better. I don't know anybody that specifically has ever said like, oh, I love my Kinect on my Xbox One.
Nobody has said that.
I don't think I've ever heard that.
I've never heard it from anybody. And that was another big problem with the Kinect. And I think, honestly, ultimately, the biggest problem and its greatest downfall, yes, it's expensive. Yes, it takes a lot of space. It doesn't work particularly great. But the biggest thing for me is that it had no good games.
There was that Star Wars.
And that was considered horrible. Like
the
people would say how
fun.
Terrible. Yeah, but that was it. That was the entire game was standing still, swinging a lightsaber around.
Yeah.
The idea sounds great. In VR, I could imagine that being a lot of fun. In Kinect, it just didn't work. So the Kinect, a little bit of failure. I don't really know anything about the PlayStation Move, and I think that in and of itself speaks to it, but...
For one, with the Move, you needed the camera, the PlayStation camera, for it to register it. But I think the PlayStation Move really paved the way for PlayStation VR. Because from what I understand, they work really well in conjunction with VR. So you get your PlayStation Move controllers, you put on your VR headset, and then you've got handheld controllers.
Right. So that's where the PlayStation Move ultimately, I think, pays off, is that PlayStation may have been thinking VR from the start, and they were like, this is just we'll use these for the VR at some point, but for now we'll release it. Now. Yeah.
And that's what I was going to say, is that I felt like they released the PS Move to go ahead and like familiarize people with the idea of the controller. Not that it had very many practical uses at all.
No.
But
it's like a volleyball game.
Maybe
all I remember.
Baseball, sports,
are great for it,
something like that. But it just made it a little more so that you could, like, once the VR came out, it was like, okay, well, I've already seen these controllers, now it makes sense.
It definitely helps, and I think it definitely helps with that.
Which
with
I guess
VR,
segues into VR in general. So, with the HTC Vive and the Vive 2 coming out and the Oculus Rift, and they all have their like proprietary controllers.
I would say so. I have my brother owns a Vive, so I've played it a decent amount when I visited him, and I personally think it's really awesome. I think that the technology it works well. The room scale works really well. It knows exactly where you are. It's fairly accurate. It's not perfect.
Right.
I wouldn't expect it to be. It's first generation, but it's fairly quite accurate. And what the VR2 or the Vive 2 or the Vive Pro as they're calling it, what I think that brings to the table is the things that really needed to be changed, which is a slightly better controllers, but really better resolution.
Yeah.
And that's something that you get a little bit of this thing called a screen effect with the original one. It kind of looks like you're looking through a screen door.
Gotcha.
And they've apparently eliminated that.
Cool.
So that's really cool. I think that's really the future. I still think VR is the future.
Right.
As
It'll
VR
get there.
Exactly. It's a matter of coming
Cheaper.
down in price.
Yeah.
And just having a little bit more accessibility for developers and for everybody else.
Right.
But I think once VR gets there, it's going to be kind of everything. I mean, that's what everyone will want to do. Why wouldn't you want to be in VR if you could? It's a hell of fun. But
yeah, I feel like there's still some things to work out with VR.
Agreed.
I'm not even opposed to the idea of just keeping like a normal controller with just like a VR display.
I think there will be that to an extent. People will that is basically what Rift had based its entire, and to a certain extent, PlayStation as well. Like the Vive was the original to come out with room scale. I will say, I think room scale makes it way more worth it.
Yeah.
Like way, way more worth it.
Because what you can walk around and it'll register it. Yeah,
exactly. You can walk around. They normally use teleporting for a lot of movement.
But smaller movement.
Small movement is all registered. I mean, there's like the Rick and Morty game is all enclosed in a really small space, but you can walk around in that small space for the most part. It really depends on how much space you have.
Yeah. Sure.
But yeah, VR I think is ultimately that's the pinnacle of control. That's like going to be the real future of it. But
yeah, we'll see.
We'll see how that goes. We'll see if the technology gets there.